World War I ended in victory for the United States and its allies, but this victory came with the destruction of cities and the deaths of millions of soldiers across Europe. The war even saw the rise of the communist USSR, which would intimidate the US and its allies for decades after World War II. According to literary critic Edmund Wilson, the chaotic world that emerged with the horrors of World War I led to a general fear of a coming disaster, and made the idea of an orderly world nostalgic in the United States. This made detective fiction popular because of the detective, who's able to catch the criminal creating chaos and return people to order. But what is detective fiction? Detective fiction is a subgenre of crime fiction that conspicuously features a detective. This detective is usually from the police, an amateur, or a private professional. Detective fiction can be thought of as a spectrum, with classical detective fiction and hard-boiled detective fiction as its two opposite poles. Classical detective fiction stories focus on the physical clues and witness testimony the detective must use to solve the crime, making up the puzzle plot. Hard-boiled detective fiction stories focus on the danger the detective faces, and are more violent and action-centered. In addition, classical detective fiction stories generally take place amongst the upper middle classes and treat crime as an anomaly, while hard-boiled detective fiction sees wealth as the source of all crime and honestly discusses modern violence. Some books, like John Dickens's Carr's The White Friar Murders or Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, are distinctly classical or hard-boiled, but others, like Henry Wade's Heir Presumptive, are a mix of both. According to Professor McCann, detective fiction is considered to be a strong genre because of its persistence, a fact that gives it value because it means detective fiction can offer a lens into how people do and have thought about justice over time. According to the great hard-boiled writer Raymond Chandler, by 1946 classical detective fiction was still more popular than hard-boiled. However, through the 1950s, hard-boiled would become strikingly more dominant than classical. This leads us to question, why did American detective fiction novels transition from mainly puzzle plots, or classical, to violent, action-centered stories, or hard-boiled, in the 2 decades after the Second World War, in ways shaped by the nostalgic interests of the post-war era? With my research, I now claim that, although hard-boiled detective fiction expressed the cynical and violent realities of modern life that classical ignored, American detective fiction in the post-war era transitioned from classical to hard-boiled because hard-boiled fulfilled a nostalgic interest in masculine individuality and sentimental domesticity, which were provoked by anti-communist fears and industrial capitalism. I also believe that understanding this can help explain why classical detective fiction, which is amongst America's most popular genres today, is enjoying a resurgence, and what this tells us about American fears right now. To understand my thesis, let's dive deeper into what it means, starting with masculine individuality and what this has to do with hard-boiled. Hard-boiled traces its roots to men's magazines, like Black Mask, and only gained literary attention later on when it was published by major houses like Knopf. Correspondingly, hard-boiled gives a lot of attention to masculinity, and the protagonist of hard-boiled novels is nearly always male. According to Professor Charles Zepka, the emphasis on individuality, in addition to masculinity, that characterizes hard-boiled, made it popular in the post-war era because of the rise of industrial capitalism. Zepka says that in the decades after the Second World War, many Americans found work in white-collar jobs like managers and clerks, and became dependent on these big businesses. He goes on to say that this made the 19th century idea of going into business for yourself and being your own boss nostalgic, which in turn made the heroes of hard-boiled, who worked under their own moral code and were often even private investigators, appealing to the many men who are not only working in big businesses, but driving mass-manufactured cars, living in mass-manufactured neighborhoods, watching mass-manufactured entertainment, and losing individuality. According to Professor Sean McCann, something else that made the masculine nature of hard-boiled appealing was the doubt in gender roles during the post-war era. An article written in 1958 by the social critic Arthur Schlesinger wrote about how women entering fields which had been considered masculine blurred gender roles and created this doubt, causing what he called the crisis of American masculinity. Expectedly, this made the idea of a more patriarchal society nostalgic to some Americans and made hard-boiled popular in turn because hard-boiled was able to scratch that itch. In summary, the rise of industrial capitalism during the post-war era led to a loss of individuality and blurred gender roles for men, This led to nostalgia for 19th century ideas like going to business for yourself and a male-dominated society, which hard-boiled satisfied, especially for male readers. In addition to masculine individuality, hard-boiled also became more popular because of sentimental domesticity. According to Leonard Cassuto, sentimental domesticity is a worldview that emphasizes family and other institutions that connect people. Sentimental domesticity has rested upon the 19th century idea of family as the ideal, even when those stereotypes bore less and less resemblance to the reality of domestic life in the 1940s and 50s. So think this, and this. By the 1950s, according to Leonard Cassuto, the idea of the traditional American family and sentimental domesticity became really important because of the Cold War. In the USSR, the ideas of sentimental domesticity were de-emphasized, and that made the family an ideological and propaganda battle. The family was a symbol of American values and became a source of American nostalgia. Although hard-boiled is distinctly masculine, hard-boiled also appealed to the growing nostalgic interest for sentimental domesticity in the post-war era. According to Cassuto, the heroes of hard-boiled stories essentially took the place of the mother in sentimental domesticity, that of protecting the community. In summary, sentimental domesticity is an idea that idealizes the traditional American family from the 19th century. Sentimental domesticity became nostalgic because of the Cold War, and because hard-boiled and sentimental domesticity share the deeper idea of serving the community in certain ways, hard-boiled was able to appeal to this interest. Now that we've discussed my argument, let's return to the thesis. We've explained why nostalgia for sentimental domesticity and masculine individuality was important for hard-boiled becoming more popular. But why were these more important than the differences in the worlds inhabited by classical, which was orderly and fake, and hard-boiled, which was more honest? To answer that question, we're going to look at The Simple Art of Murder by Raymond Chandler. Chandler has been called the George Washington of hard-boiled and was an authority on the subject. In his book, The Simple Art of Murder, Chandler argues that classical detective fiction is too artificial, but American hard-boiled is more realistic and serious. He complains that classical detective fiction is ridiculous, that the crimes are almost games and the murders are too complicated. And on most of those charges, he wouldn't be wrong. But if we analyze more of Chandler's complaints, we will see connections to the idea of serving the community in sentimental domesticity, a defense and references to the masculinity that so characterizes hard-boiled, and connections to individuality. So because masculine individuality and sentimental domesticity are almost themes of Chandler's essay, we can say that they are more significant than what's just on the exterior, that hard-boiled became more popular than classical because of its different and more realistic environment. Today, classical detective fiction is enjoying a resurgence. Some organizations, like Pushkin Vertigo, have been especially important to this, bringing about 100 detective fiction stories into English translation and to American readers just recently. Of course, hard-boiled is still the dominant pole of the subgenre in both print and especially film, and although we only studied the 2 decades after the Second World War, the same nostalgic interest for masculine individuality and sentimental domesticity drove it to where we are today, although these characteristics may have been less pronounced. Similarly, the same nostalgic interest for a more orderly world has still been driving classical detective fiction, and it's especially important today, along with access to better translations. It's easy to see why a fear of the chaos in our world has been growing recently, and how it's been encouraging the nostalgic interest that classical feeds upon. Some of these events, like the Russia-Ukraine war, are especially important because, even though Americans don't hear missile attacks, the simultaneous resurgence of classical detective fiction shows that they do add to a tension from fear growing within the nation. I started reading classical detective fiction during the pandemic, starting with the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, then novels by Agatha Christie, and now Honkaku novels from Japan and Impossible Situation Murders. Being a reader of classical detective fiction has been really important to me because it's made me a part of what I've learned is not only a considerable American phenomenon, but an international event and community as well. It's also been a real boon to me as our country, and maybe the world in large, goes through a kind of upheaval. I'm really focused on what goes on in the world, and reading classical detective fiction has allowed me to focus on something pleasurable and still mentally stimulating in a way that mirrors, as I've learned with this project, others did almost 100 years ago.